Chapter 31. Davos. Few places on earth were at once so vast in the popular imagination and so diminutive in physical scale. Essentially a mile or so of houses and buildings clustered mostly along a single road. Hulking, snow-laden conifers surrounded it like frosted sentries. Geographers knew it as the highest altitude resort town in Europe. But this was not merely a truth about its physical elevation. For a few days every year, it represented the pinnacle of financial and political power as well. Indeed, the town had become synonymous with the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, a gathering of the world's global elite that took place there in the last week of January, when the seasonal gloom ensured that the visiting Illuminati would sparkle and shine even more brightly. Although the forum was dedicated to the free movement of capital and labor and ideas, it was itself a heavily guarded encampment. Surrounding a sprawling compound of semi-spheres and blocks, the Congress Center, where the conference was actually held, were hundreds of Swiss military policemen. Temporary steel fences blocked off all points of informal entrance. Now he left the van in a parking lot behind an old, bleak church with a steeple like a witch's hat and trudged up a narrow street. Reginaweg to the town's main street, the promenade. The sidewalks had been carefully cleared of snow, the result of ceaseless efforts. Wind continually swept in snow from the slopes even when none was falling from the skies. The promenade was an arcade of sorts, with one shop after another, interrupted only by the occasional hotel and restaurant. Nor was there anything quaint about the storefronts. Here were upscale outlets of international brands like Bally, Chopard, Rolex, Paul & Shark, Prada. He passed a store selling linens called Bet und Besser, and a tall modern building that displayed 3 flags as if it were a consulate. In fact, it was a UBS branch office displaying the flags of the state, the canton, and the company. Ambler had no doubt which of those commanded the bank's true fealty. Only the hotels, the Post Hotel with an iconic horn above its giant block letters, or the Morosani Schweizerhof with the green and black image of traditional alpine boots above its marquee, suggested any local character. Davos might have been one of the most remote places in the world, but the world was here in full metallic plumage. Cars with well-studded tires and headlights on high beam. He saw a dark blue Honda, a silvery Mercedes, a boxy Opel SUV, a Ford minivan, drive through the streets at ridiculously fast speeds. Otherwise, the battery of storefronts put him in mind of a Hollywood set, a backlot Dodge City. One was continually reminded how narrow the town was, because the enfolding vastness of mountain slopes was nearly always visible, a frozen cataract of trees spilling from an unseen summit. The folds of the earth itself, a looming incomprehensible pattern of ridges, whorls, and arches like God's own fingerprints, made everything else appear inauthentic and permanent. The oldest building he passed was a sparely elegant stone structure marked Canton Spolize, an office of the regional police. But its residents, too, were only guests, policing what could not be policed, the immovable snow-clad mountains, the ungovernable human soul. And what of his own soul? Ambler was exhausted, that was the truth. Deluged by information that might mean anything or nothing. His spirits were as dim and chilled as the day was. He felt insignificant, impotent, isolated. The man who wasn't there, not even to himself. Soft, sardonic voices began to clamor within his skull, berating and questioning. Here he was, near the top of a mountain, and he had never felt so at sea. The ground beneath his feet seemed to rock and sway gently but perceptibly. What was happening to him? Hypoxia, surely, mountain sickness, the effects of high altitude on those unacclimated to it, which could sometimes diminish blood oxygenation and cause mental confusion. He took deep breaths of the thin mountain air, tried to orient himself to the world around him. As he craned his head and took in the wall-like mountain peaks that seemed to rise up inches away from him, claustrophobia overtook him, casting him back to the rubber-coated enclosures of Parrish Island. And suddenly, eddying through his mind was that stream of jargon to which he had been subjected. Dissociative identity disorder, personality fragmentation, paranoia, abreactive ego dystonia. It was madness, theirs, not his, and he would overcome it, had overcome it, for his search for himself was what had led him here. Unless that odyssey itself was the madness. Joining the shadows that surrounded him were the shadows he had tried too hard to banish from his mind. A booming, exultant voice of a burly industrialist. "You're the man who wasn't there. You officially don't exist." The gingerly tones of the brilliant blind Osiris. "It's Occam's razor. What's the simplest explanation? It's easier to alter the contents of your head than it is to change the whole world. You know about all those behavioral science programs from the 50s, right? The program names changed, but the research never was discontinued." The psychiatrist with the rectangular black-framed glasses, the long brown forelock, the felt-tip pens, and the words that burn like an electrocautery. "The question I'm putting to you is the question you need to put to yourself. Who are you?" Ambler staggered into an alleyway, and then behind a dumpster, leaning against the wall and trying, with a low groan, to drive away the clamoring, overlapping voices, the hellish din. He could not fail. He would not fail. He filled his lungs with another deep breath and another, and squeezed his eyes shut, telling himself that it was the stinging wind that was making them water. In the brief interval of blackness, he would pull himself together, except that his mind now filled with the image of a computer screen. Now a whole series of screens, impossible to bring into focus except for a blinking cursor in the center of each one. A cursor pulsing like a warning beacon at the end of a single, short line. Harrison Ambler not found. He doubled over in a retch, the first wave followed by a second even more powerful. Now he stood bent, almost crouching, his hands on his knees, oblivious to the cold, to everything, panting like a dog in August. Another voice, another face entered his mind, and it was as if the sun itself had appeared, burning away the darkness of his misery and despair. "I believe in you," Laura Helen was saying, pulling him close. "I believe. You need to believe too." Moments later, the sickness passed. Ambler straightened up and felt his strength and resolve returning. He had swum free from the inky depths of his own psyche and shot to the surface, had emerged from a nightmare that was peculiarly his own. Now he had to enter another nightmare, knowing that if he failed, the world itself would be entering, and it might never emerge. Checking his watch to verify that he remained on schedule, Ambler made his way toward the largest of the Davos hotels, the Steigenberger Hotel Belvedere on Promenade 89, catty-corner from the main entrance to the Kongresscentrum. The giant structure was a former sanatorium built in 1875. Its pink exterior was fenestrated with narrow arching windows, mimicking the embrasures of the battle-ready castles of the feudal era. But the only visible clashes in the week of the forum's annual conference were between corporate sponsorships. KPMG had a large blue and white banner mounted over the hotel's porte cochere, jostling for attention with a nearby sign for shuttle services that was emblazoned with the 4 interlocked rings of the Audi logo. His pulse quickened as he approached the entrance, lining the hotel's circular drive. Alongside the usual luxury cars were military transport vehicles and a large-tired SUV with a blue rectangular police light on top and a day-glow red band along the side, against which the words Militar Police were lettered in white. Across the street, the sidewalk was barricaded with a 10-foot-tall steel grating topped with sharpened points, Lacey the Great was a candy-striped banner printed with a firm advisory to keep out in the three major Swiss languages: Sperre Zone, Zone Interdicte, Zona Sparata. Caston, he knew from a voicemail he listened to en route, had succeeded in joining the conference center officially. He had used his pull as a senior CIA official to have himself added to the roster of guests. For Ambler, however, that would not be possible, and Caston had so far learned nothing. The task, after all, required perception, not ratiocination, or perhaps it required a miracle. Inside the Belvedere's vestibule was a large SISAL entrance mat for stamping out the snow from one's feet. Beyond the double doors, SISAL gave way to elegant Wilton-style carpeting in a subtle floral pattern. A brisk walk-through revealed several parlors that flowed one into another, as well as a dining area roped off with red velvet ropes and stanchions topped with ornamental brass pineapples. Ambler returned to a parlor not far from the hotel's front desk, where, from a discreet angle, he could watch people entering the hotel, and took a seat on a tufted leather chair above mahogany DADOES. The walls were covered in black and burgundy striped silk and decorated with arcading. He glanced at himself in a mirror across the wall, satisfied that, just as he now was in an expensive-looking charcoal gray nail-head suit, he looked the part he was playing. He would be taken for one of the many businessmen who, not so illustrious as the participants, had paid very significant amounts to attend, those, that is, whose applications were accepted in the first place. In the rarefied realm of the World Economics Forum, the paying guest was regarded with the sort of condescension a penniless scholarship boy would have met with at an exclusive boarding school. At home, such men, heads of local businesses or mayors of mid-sized cities, could imagine themselves to be masters of the universe. At Davos, they were its minions. Ambler ordered a coffee black from one of the harried but pleasant attendants, and lingered over the various business publications on the small table nearby. The Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Far Eastern Economic Review, Newsweek International, and The Economist. When he picked up The Economist, he felt a small twinge. On the cover was a photograph of Liu Eng, looking cheerful, above the sprightly legend, "Bringing the People's Republic back to the people." He quickly flipped through the cover story, his eyes skimming through the copy, pausing at the bold subheads. "The Sea Turtle Returns" ran one. "American Influence Debated" was another. At frequent intervals, his eyes flicked up, watching the hotel guests come and go. Before long, he found a promising candidate, an Englishman in his early 40s with graying blonde hair. Someone in banking, to judge by his spread collar, his finely patterned yellow tie. He had just entered the hotel and looked slightly annoyed with himself, as if he had foolishly left behind an item that he needed. His round cheeks were still pink from the cold, and his black cashmere topcoat bore a few flakes of snow. Ambler hurriedly left a few francs by his coffee cup and caught up with the businessman just as he was striding into a waiting elevator. Ambler stepped into the car moments before the door closed. The businessman had pressed the fourth-floor button. Ambler pressed the button again as if he had not realized it was already lit. He glanced at the man's conference badge. Martin Hibbard, it read. Moments later, Ambler followed him out of the elevator and down the hall, noting the number of the room where the businessman stopped, but taking care to walk past him with a steady gait, vanishing at the turn at the end of the hall. Just out of sight, Ambler stopped, listened to the door shut behind the Englishman, and then half a minute later opened again. The Englishman emerged, clutching a leather portfolio, and returned to the elevator bank. Given the time of day and his late-for-meeting air, it was a safe assumption that he had a lunch appointment and had a need of whatever documents were in the portfolio. In all likelihood, he would then head to the Congress Center for one of the 2:30 sessions, and would not be back to his hotel room for hours. Ambler returned to the lobby and scanned the various clerks at the front desk, an elegant station of mahogany and marble. One of them, a woman in her late 20s with slightly too much lipstick and eyeshadow, would be his best chance, he decided. He would not take his chances with the shaven-headed man in his 40s, although he was free, nor with the older, graying woman with the fixed smile and an underslept look about her eyes. When the younger woman had finished up with the guest she had been dealing with, an African frustrated by his inability to exchange nairas for Swiss francs, Ambler stepped forward with a sheepish expression. "I'm such a moron," he said. "Can you tell?" "I'm sorry." Her English was only lightly accented. "I'm sorry, I left my key card in my room." "Not to worry, sir," the woman said pleasantly. "That happens all the time." "Not to me, it doesn't. The name's Martin Hibbard, I should say." "And the room number? What is it now?" Ambler pretended that he was racking his memory. "Oh, I remember. 417. The woman behind the marble counter rewarded him with a commending smile, keyed a few codes into her computer. Moments later, a new key card emerged from a machine behind her, and she handed it to him. "Hope you're enjoying your stay," she said. "You know I am, actually," Ambler said. "Thanks to you." She smiled gratefully at the rare compliment. Room 417 turned out to be spacious and grandly appointed with light, airy colors and delicate furniture. A Sheraton-style highboy, a wing chair, a small desk, and hardback wooden chair in the far corner. There was not a room for rent in the whole Davos clusters area, not during the last week of January, but the one he had taken momentary possession of would serve at least for a while. He made the phone call, turned off the lights, drew the curtains shut, including the inner room darkening ones, and waited. The knock at the door came 10 minutes later. Ambler pressed himself against the wall adjacent to the unhinged side of the door. That was standard placement, something that he had learned in training, something that was second nature to an operative like Harrison Ambler, if Harrison Ambler was really who he was. An effluent of black anxiety arose in him like a toxic plume from a smokestack. He unlatched the door, opened it a crack. The room was dark, but he did not have to see. He could smell her shampoo, the fabric softener on her clothes, the honeyed scent of her skin. "Hal?" Her voice, barely more than a whisper. She closed the door behind her. He spoke quietly, too, in order not to startle her. "Over here," he said, and his mouth formed a smile as involuntary as a sneeze, a sob, a laugh. It almost seemed to light the room by itself. She stepped toward Ambler's voice, reached a hand out to his face like a blind person, found his cheek, caressed it, and now stood very near him. He felt her warmth, could feel her lips brushing his, and the contact was electric. He put his arms around her and drew her close, feeling her cheek against the top of his chest, and now he kissed her hair, her ear, her neck, inhaling deeply. He had to savor every moment he had with her, though he knew he might not survive the day. A curious radiance swelled within him, the assurance that whatever happened to him, he would not die unloved. "Laurel," he breathed, She pressed her mouth to his, silencing him and seeming to draw courage from his kiss. "I know," she said after a pause. He cradled her face in both his hands and gently moved his thumbs across her cheeks, along the tender skin beneath her eyes. They were wet, had just become so. "You don't have to say the words," she said, her voice thickened by emotion but still hushed. She stepped into his embrace again, on her tippy toes, he realized, pressing her mouth to his once more. For a long moment he was aware of nothing else but her. Her warmth, her smell, her firm, soft, trembling flesh pressed against his. Even the slow beating of her heart. The rest of the world vanished for him, the hotel room, the town, the mission, the world itself. Nothing else existed but the two of them, a two-ness that was somehow no longer a two-ness at all. He felt her clutching him, no longer desperately, but with an odd serenity that had somehow suffused them both. Now they both relaxed and stepped back, attuneness again. He flipped the switch near the door. With illumination, the space they were in changed too. It became smaller, cozier, rendered more intimate by the opulent textures and colors. Laurel somehow did not change. She was exactly as he had pictured her, as if the image in his mind had materialized before his eyes. The large, green-flecked hazel eyes filled with yearning, love, concern. The porcelain skin and full, slightly parted lips. It was a look that radiated utter devotion, a look of the sort one rarely saw outside the movies. Only it was real. It was here, within arm's reach. It was the realest thing there was. "Thank God you're safe, my darling, my love," she said quietly. "Thank God you're safe." "You're so beautiful," he spoke, the thought aloud, without consciously intending to. "My Ariadne." "Let's just leave," she said, a sudden wild sense of hope transforming her features. "Let's ski down that mountain and never look back." "Laurel," he said. "Just us," she said. "What happens will happen. We'll have each other." "Soon," he said, "in just a few hours." Laurel blinked slowly. She had been trying to keep her fear at bay, but it was spilling over now, unstoppable. "Oh, my darling," she said, "I have a bad feeling about this. I can't shake it." There was a quiver in her voice. Her eyes glistened moistly. The fear that ran through him now was fear for her own safety. "Did you talk to Caston about it?" She smiled ruefully through her tears. Talk to Caston about feelings? He just started about odds and probabilities. Sounds like Caston. Long odds and slim probabilities. She was no longer smiling. "I think he has a bad feeling too, only he doesn't admit to having feelings. Some people find it easier that way. He says you're going to do what you're going to do, no matter how long the odds of success are." Did his handheld calculator tell him that? Ambler shook his head. "But he's not wrong." "I don't want to lose you, Hal." She closed her eyes briefly. "I can't lose you." She spoke louder than she had meant to. "My God, Laurel," he said, "I don't want to lose you either." And then somehow there's a strange way that... He shook his head, for there were words he could not speak, could not expect anyone to understand. His life had been cheap before, cheap to himself. He had never thought of it that way, was only now in a position to recognize it, because it was no longer cheap. It contained something of infinite value. It contained Laurel. Yet it was because of Laurel that he was here. It was because of Laurel that he would do what had to be done. He could not go to ground, disappear within some sprawling South American metropolis, living out an anonymous existence while warfare broke out among the great powers. A world that contained Laurel was a world that suddenly and intensely mattered to him. These were the things Ambler thought and could not say. He just gazed at her for a few moments, both of them gathering their fortitude for what lay ahead of them. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. The words returned to him like acid splashing in his throat. He could not begin to fathom the sort of global upheaval that would occur if the Palmerite conspiracy succeeded. Ambler moved to the window, peered out toward the low-slung complex of buildings across the street, the Congress Center. Military policemen stood in clusters almost entirely clad in midnight blue. It was the color of their zippered trousers, nylon shell jackets, and woolen caps, save for a turquoise stripe on the inside of their flipped-up jacket collars and their black, high lace-up boots. When they stood close together, it was as if they brought the night with them. Tall fences of tubular steel, partly buried in snow, funneled visitors to a precisely indicated point of egress. Ambler had seen maximum security prisons that were more inviting than this. "Maybe Caston will figure out a way," Laurel said. "He got me in. Not that I learned a damn thing." "He got you in?" Ambler was astonished. She nodded. "He figured out that technically I've got an intel service classification, high-level clearance, right? The WEF office was able to get official confirmation of that. Fact is, the groundskeepers at Parrish Island have high-level clearance too. Them's the rules at a facility like that. But how are they to know? It's all about these letters and numbers that go after your name, and Caston's a whiz at working the system. Where is he, by the way? Should be here any minute, Laurel said. I came early. She did not have to explain why. But maybe he's hit on something, found one of those anomalies of his. Listen, Caston is a good man, but he's an analyst, a numbers guy. What we're dealing with is people, not the electronic vapor trail they leave. Someone rapped on the door 3 times. Laurel recognized the tattoo and let Clayton Caston in. His tan raincoat bore epaulets of snow which were dissolving into rivulets down the front. Caston himself looked exhausted, even more pallid than usual. He had a black tote bag in one hand, silkscreen with the logo of the World Economic Forum. He looked at Ambler without a flicker of surprise. You find out anything? Ambler asked him. Not a whole lot, the auditor said soberly. I was inside the conference center for an hour and a half. Like I said, I was here once before, on a panel to do with offshore financial institutions and international money laundering. They've always got a lot of technical seminars along with the glitzier events. This morning I was wandering around the place, went in and out of the seminars. I ought to have a button that says, Ask me about transnational capital flows. Laurel got around too, but it sounds like she didn't strike gold either. The whole place kind of gives me the willies, Laurel admitted. So many faces you recognize from magazines and the TV news. Makes you dizzy. It's just a reflex, but at first you keep nodding at people because they look familiar, and you somehow think you must know each other. Then you realize they just look familiar because they're famous. Caston nodded. Davos makes Bilderberg look like the Muncie Chamber of Commerce. Kept feeling that I stood out somehow, that everybody could tell I didn't belong, Laurel went on, and the thought that one of them, just one of them, might be this maniac. We're not dealing with a maniac, Ambler said carefully. We're dealing with a professional. Far worse. He paused. But there's good news, too. The simple fact that both of you were able to gain entrance, Ambler said. That was your doing, Caston. I'm still not sure how you pulled it off. You forget that I'm a senior officer of the Central Intelligence Agency, the auditor said. I had my assistant call the office of the executive chairman, get my name added to the DC retinue, an official sounding call from Langley with lots of callback info, security assurances. They didn't argue. They don't mind having spooks at the table here. Mind? They love it. You still don't get it. Davos is all about power of every kind. They'd be delighted to have the DCI himself. He was here a couple of years ago, but they're quite pleased to have a senior CIA official too. And you got Laurel on the books the same way? My assistant swung it, actually. We described her as a psychiatric specialist with the Joint Intelligence Services, which happens to be her technical designation. She's also got a 12A-56J level of clearance, which happens to be mandatory for Parrish Island personnel. The last-minute nature of the request was slightly irregular, but not remarkably so, especially given their dealings with U.S. intel folks. The rest was a matter of elision, shall we say. But the WEF security people wouldn't just take your word for it, would they? Of course not. They called Langley, reached my office through the switchboard, that's standard, as I say, the callback procedure, and had a second discussion with my assistant. I gather he intimated things about how it would be a special favor to the DCI and the Secretary of State, that sort of thing. Then he provides them a zero-knowledge passcode for purposes of verification. See, there's a system for limited access intranet verification developed for collaborative operations with other nations. Upshot is that they can get an abbreviated personnel listing, a stub is the term, which provides C-level confirmation of what they've been told. My office then transmits a digital photograph for the security card. There's a JIS pick on file, and we're in Lake Flynn. You know, I almost understand what you just said. Ambler tilted his head, but hang on. You agreed the security system here was foolproof. Pretty much foolproof, yeah. Do I look like a fool? So can you do the same for me? Let me think. Are you on the employee rolls at the CIA? Caston's lids fluttered with a suppressed eye roll. Do you have a personnel record with the Joint Intelligence Services Division? If they call the switchboard at Langley to verify your employment and rank, what are they going to be told? But Harrison Ambler does not exist, Caston snapped. Or have you forgotten? Hate to be the one to break the news, but they erased you, all right? The World Economic Forum traffics in data, bits, and bytes. It's a world of digital signatures, digital records, digital confirmation. I'd have an easier time getting a WEF security badge issued to Bigfoot or Yeti or the goddamn Loch Ness Monster. They don't exist either, but at least you can find them on the internet. You finished. My fears were all finished. Caston's eyes blazed. All this time I figured you were holding back some grand scheme you had. The hell of it is, you're even more reckless than I'd imagined. You race pell-mell into a potential disaster area without a plan. You don't think ahead. Hell, you don't think, period. From the outset, our chances were between slim and none. Well, Slim's just left the house. Ambler felt as if the force of gravity had suddenly doubled. His limbs felt like lead. Just break it down for me. Tell me how the badge system is organized physically. You can't bullshit your way in if that's what you're thinking, Caston grumbled. And you can't get in by doing whatever the opposite of bullshitting is, that peephole to the brain trick you do. The system is very simple and damn near impossible to spoof. He unbuttoned his gray woolen polyester suit jacket. Ambler noticed a faint smell of mothballs about it and showed them the identification badge he was wearing on a white nylon string around his neck. It was deceptively simple. A white plastic rectangle with a photograph of Caston to the left of his name. There is a silvery square hologram below, a blue color stripe above. He turned it around, exposing the magnetic stripe on the back. Mine's the same, Laurel put in. Doesn't look like much. Couldn't you just steal one and alter it? Caston shook his head. When you enter, you swipe the card through a reader. The card encodes a digital signature that calls up a guest record from the computer. Now, that computer at the door has the most powerful kind of cybersecurity you can ask for. It's quote-unquote air-gapped. In other words, it's a standalone, not connected to the internet, so you can't hack into it. And there's a guard stationed at a monitor, and every time a card is read, the name and photograph from the computer record get displayed on the screen. Point is, if you're not already in the computer, you're shit out of luck. That's the technical term. And then there's a metal detector you've got to pass through, like at the airport. Caston went on. Jackets, keys, and such go through a conveyor belt. Enough to keep out an assassin, Laura asked. We're talking about someone who has been planning this for months, maybe longer, Caston replied. He glanced at Ambler. You've got about 2 hours. Ambler wandered over where Laurel had been standing and peered out the window into the gloomy afternoon again. Snow was drifting down, lazily but steadily. What were his options? He felt a rising sense of panic, knew he must keep that emotion at bay. It could freeze him up, cause him to choke, to lose touch with his instincts. Laurel's voice, what if you say you've lost your card? Then they apologize and escort you to the exit, Caston replied. I saw that happen when I was here a few years back, and they don't care if you're the king of Morocco. Everyone inside that place has a card around his neck. Even heads of states? Laurel pressed. I just saw the Vice President of the United States, and he was wearing a slate blue suit and a yellow tie, and a Davos ID card about 5 inches below the knot. It's simple and it's ironclad. These people don't play. They've never had a security breach in some 3 decades, and there's a reason for that. When Ambler turned back to the others, Laurel was looking at him expectantly. There's got to be something, right? The human factor, like you always say. Ambler heard her words as if they had been spoken from a long distance away. Scenarios flitted by in his mind, entertained, considered, explored, and rejected, all within seconds. Almost every organization had the porosity of human discretion because day-to-day practicalities demanded some measure of flexibility. But the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum was not a day-to-day institution. It was a special event lasting just 1 week. Here, rules really could be infinitely stringent. Not enough time ever elapsed for the security officers to start taking much for granted. Ambler's eyes fell on the black WEF tote bag that Caston had been carrying, filled with the material that people were given at check-in. He picked it up and spilled its contents on the bed. There was a copy of Global Agenda, the WEF magazine that was prepared for the occasion, and a white binder with the schedule of events. Ambler flipped through it page after page, listed panels with such stultifying titles as Weather Water Management, Securing the Global Health System, The Future of U.S. Foreign Policy, Human Security and National Security, Friends or Foes, Toward a New Bretton Woods. There was the schedule of addresses by the UN Secretary General, the United States Vice President, the President of Pakistan, and others. Liu Eng's address was clearly the culminating and keynote event. Ambler closed the binder and picked up a short, thick, almost cubicle book listing all the participants in the WEF annual meeting. Nearly 1,500 pages featuring photographs of each, followed by a career biography crammed in small sans-serif type. Look at all the faces here, Ambler said. He rolled a thumb across its width like a riffle animation. Make a hell of a police lineup, Laurel put in. Frustration began to fill the air like a stench. Suddenly, Casson sat bolt upright. A police lineup, he echoed. Ambler looked at him, saw something in Caston's eyes that almost scared him. His eyes were practically swiveling in their sockets. What are you on about? He prompted in a low voice. They ought to be outlawed, Caston said. Lineups, I mean. They're responsible for a god-awful number of false convictions. The error rates are insupportable. You're exhausted, Laurel said quickly. She turned to Ambler anxiously. He didn't sleep on the train at all. Let him talk, Ambler said softly. Because eyewitnesses are highly fallible, Caston went on. You saw someone do a bad thing, and you're led to believe that one of the people in the lineup may be the fellow that you saw. So you look, and there's a heuristic that most people follow. They choose the one who looks most like the person they remember. Why is that a problem? Laurel sounded puzzled. Because the closest person isn't necessarily the same person. It's number 4, they say. It's number 2. And sometimes number 4 or number 2 is a cop, a stand-in, and there's no harm, no foul. The investigators thank the witness and send him on his way. But as the odds will have it, sometimes that guy is a suspect. Not the actual perp, but a suspect. He happens to look a little more like the fellow you saw than any of the others, but he's not the fellow you saw. All of a sudden, you've got an eyewitness testifying against the suspect. Can you point to the man that you saw that night? And that whole rigmarole, and a jury imagines that nothing could be more open and shut than that. Now there's a way to elicit what an eyewitness saw without that distortion. You do it seriatim. Show them photographs of people, not at the same time, but one after another. You ask, is this the one? Yes or no. If you switch to the seriatim method, the rate of misidentification plunges from 7% to less than 1%. It's an outrage that people in law enforcement haven't grasped these basic statistics. He looked up, suddenly sharp. But my point is, in the real world, often enough, close gets your goddamn cigar. He blinked rapidly. The data are very clear on this. Ergo, We find the person who looks most like you, 1,500 faces. That's a sample space we can work with. Ambler did not reply right away. As Caston stood near him, Ambler began to flip through the book rapidly, methodically, a wetted forefinger whisking through almost mechanically. I want you to look at the pictures too, he told Laurel. If it's close enough, you'll know it at once. Don't think about it. Don't just look. Experience it. If it's workable, you'll know it in an instant. The faces flew by about 2 per second. Wait, Laurel said. Caston stuck a small rectangular post-it on the page and said, keep going. Ambler did, whisking through the next 100 pages without interruption until he paused at one. Caston placed another adhesive flag on the page, and Ambler resumed paging through. When Ashton Palmer's face appeared, Ambler paused briefly. None of them spoke. None of them had to. It was the same when he reached Ellen Whitfield's page. She looked blandly handsome as her mentor looked distinguished, but their coiled intelligence and ambition was filtered out of the official postage stamp-sized photograph. At this point, their images provided nothing but distraction. By the time Ambler had gone through the entire book, 4 pages had been flagged. Ambler handed the book over to Caston. You've got the fresh eyes. Take a look. Caston flipped to each of the 4. The third one, he said, passing it to Laurel, who did the same. Probably the third, she said a little more hesitantly. Ambler opened the book to the 3rd post-it flag and tore off the page, scrutinizing the man's biography. Not the strongest resemblance, I wouldn't have thought, Ambler said half to himself. But then I have a hard time remembering what I look like these days. He glanced at the black and white photograph. The man's eyes conveyed a self-regarding severity bordering on hauteur, though it was hard to know how much of it was him, how much the particular photograph. Josef Vrabel was his name, and he was the president of V&S Slovakia, a Bratislava-based company that specialized in wireless solutions, services, and products, and security and access networks. I don't mean to puncture the mood, Laurel said, but how are we going to get the guy's card in the first place? Don't ask me, Caston said, shrugging. Ask Mr. Human Factor over here. Can we find him? Ambler looked at Caston and then peered out of the window again. On the roof, 2 stories above him, a pair of sharpshooters were on patrol, he knew. Yet what good were weapons without a target? How ironic that he had first outwit those who saw it as he did to ensure security. The enemies of his enemies were his enemies. Now his gaze settled on a long, dark blue wall, a solid but movable barrier that stood in front of the Congress Center's poured concrete exterior. Along its length was a series of large white rectangles with the blue logo, World Economic Forum, each word stacked on top of one another with a thin crescent curling through the O's. To the left there is a sign with the same logo and arrows directing media/staff to a different entrance than the middle entry meant for participants. Fear, hopelessness, and sheer rage swirled within him, and the result somehow was to form an alloy stronger than any of its components, an alloy of sheer resolve. It took him a few moments before he realized that Caston had been speaking. Wonders of technology, the numbers maven was saying. There's a computer intranet at the conference center and a lot of the hotels here too. It's all designed so you can find people. The networking aspect is pretty key to the Davos experience. You do any networking when you were there, Caston? I don't network, was the peevish response. I analyze networks. Point is, if I go to the lobby, they'll have a terminal there. I can type in this name and it'll say what programs he's signed up to attend. Because you have to sign up, you see, then you find him and tell him that there's an emergency and bring him outside the center. Caston coughed. Me? How are you at lying? Caston reflected for a moment. Mediocre. Mediocre will be good enough, Ambler said. He reached over and gave Caston an encouraging squeeze on the shoulder. Caston squirmed at his touch. Sometimes if it's worth doing badly. If I can help, Laurel began. I'm going to need you on the logistics front, Ambler told her. He started to explain. I'll need binoculars or some high-powered device for vision enhancement. There are more than 1,000 people at the center. According to the printed agenda, the president of China is scheduled to speak at the Congress Hall. That's the biggest hall in the place, Caston said. Seats 1,000 easily, maybe more. That's a lot of faces, and I'm not going to be able to get near them all. You're going to stick out if you start walking around with a pair of binocs around your neck, Laurel cautioned. You could attract the wrong kind of attention. You're talking about security surveillance. That place is camera central, Laurel said, with all the broadcast cameramen around. How's that? I had a chat with one of the camera guys, Laurel replied. Thought it might turn up something useful. Turns out that the WEF records a lot of events for its own purposes. But more than that, the major events, plenary sessions, and a few open forums are taped by some of the major broadcast media, the BBC, CNN International, Sky TV, SBC, like that. Amazing lenses on those cameras. I took a peek through the viewfinder of one. Ambler tilted his head. So I was thinking you could use one of those just for the zoom. Those television cameras, they're portable but bulky, and they have a powerful optical zoom. That's better than any binocular, and they're nothing that would attract a second look. Ambler felt a tiny flutter within him. My God, Laurel, he said. Don't look so shocked that I had a good idea, she joshed. Only thing I'm wondering is, why would the head of V&S Slovakia be toting a camera through the convention hall? It's not an issue when you're inside, Caston said. You need the badge to enter. Once you're in, nobody's going to be paying that much attention. The badge itself doesn't display your affiliation, just your name. Once you're inside, it's a whole different ballgame. What about getting hold of a camera? Ambler asked. Not a problem. I know just how to pick up a couple, Laurel said. The guys I spoke to showed me a storeroom full of them. Listen, Laurel, you're not trained for operation. You're in a life raft and you want to check whether someone has a boater license? Caston scoffed. I thought I was supposed to be the rule stickler here. Fact is, it's going to be easier for me than for Joseph Rabel to get into that storeroom, Laurel said. And I've already had friendly chats with the boys who go in and out of it. In a mock vampish tone, she added, I may not have skills, but I do have assets. Ambler looked at her. I just don't see a way. Laurel gave a half smile. I do. The funny thing, Adrian Choi reflected as he sat at Clayton Caston's wonderfully tidy desk, was that his boss managed to create as much work for him when he was away as when he was in the office. Caston's recent telephone calls had been abrupt, hurried, and cryptic. Lots of urgent requests, no explanations. It was all very mysterious. Adrian was loving it. He was even enjoying his slight hangover this morning. A hangover. An unaccustomed sensation for him. It seemed so very Derek St. John. In those Clive McCarthy page-turners, Derek St. John was always prone to overindulgence. Too much is never enough was among his signature lines. Another was instant gratification tries my patience. In the line of duty, he was regularly obliged to spend long evenings seducing beautiful women, ordering costly champagnes with French names that Adrian couldn't pronounce, followed by a morning hangover. It's pronounced St. John, the super spy would suavely, waggishly explain to those women who mispronounced his surname. With the stress falling on sin. Derek St. John even had a special hangover recipe detailed in Clive McCarthy's Operation Atlantis, but it contained raw eggs, and Adrian didn't think it was a good idea to eat raw eggs. Not that Adrian had spent the evening with a long-legged supermodel known to be an associate of a villainous quadriplegic who lived in a special zero-gravity satellite circling the Earth, which is what had happened in Operation Atlantis. Adrian's evening was definitely more earthbound. When he thought about it, actually, he had a twinge of guilt, which wasn't very Derek St. John at all. Her name was Caitlin Easton, and she was an administrative assistant at the Joint Facilities Center. On the phone, her voice had become giggly and appealing once he had warmed her up. Adrian had to hide his disappointment when they finally met at Grenville's Grill. She was just a little heavier than he had imagined, and he noticed the beginnings of a pimple near one corner of her nose. Not that the place he brought her to was any great shakes. Grenville's Grill was a self-styled eatery in Tyson's Corner, where the staff slapped down oversized laminated menus, served potato chips in annoying little napkin-lined baskets, and put toothpicks in its club sandwiches. It just happened to be on the way home for both of them. Still, the more they spoke, the more he saw that she had a lively sense of humor, and he'd had a pretty decent time. When he told her his full name, saying it's Adrian Choi, with the stress falling on Oi, she laughed, though she couldn't have caught the reference. She laughed at a lot of things, he said, even when they weren't especially funny, and that gave him a real high. She was fun. So why the twinge? Well, he had been using her, hadn't he? He'd said, hey, if you're not doing anything after work, maybe we could have a drink, grab a bite. He hadn't said, you guys have something my boss needs. So in a way, the whole operation was a little undercover. And Caitlin Easton wasn't an enemy agent after all. She was just, well, a file clerk in plain English. The phone purred an inside call. Caitlin? Yes, it was Caitlin. He took a deep breath. Hey, you, he said, surprising himself. He sounded more relaxed than he'd felt. Hey, you, she said. That was fun last night. Yeah, she said, yeah, it was. She lowered her voice. Hey, listen, I think I've got something for you. Really? I don't want you to get into any more hot water with your boss is all. You're talking about... Caitlin, I don't know how to thank you. You'll think of a way, Caitlin giggled. Adrian blushed. Ambler's first glance of Joseph Rabel was in the flesh was disheartening. The person he had chosen for a doppelganger was an unimpressive man, barely 5'5", with a small head, narrow shoulders, and a round protruding belly over wide hips. He looked like a human tap. If Caston was right, though, all that had to match was the face, and the face was, well, close enough for a quick glance by someone who was looking for similarities rather than differences. I don't understand, the Slovak businessman, drably garbed in a suit of taupe gabardine, was repeating as Caston led him from the Congress Center. The heavy clouds transformed the street into a Grisaille version of itself, a picture done in shades of gray. It's crazy, I know, Caston was saying, but the agency has already negotiated a deal with Slovakia Telecom, and it's our last chance to reconsider. We're almost out of the due diligence period. Otherwise, contractually, it takes effect by the end of the day. But why were we never contacted about this? This is ridiculously last minute. The Slovak's English was accented but fluent. You're surprised that the United States government mishandled an RFP? You're asking how it could possibly be that our federal government could mishandle the bidding process. The Slovak snorted when you put it that way. Ambler, who had stationed himself across the street, strode swiftly toward him. Mr. Vrabel, I'm Andy Halverson with the U.S. General Services Administration. Clay here says we're about to make a pretty costly mistake. I need to know if he's right. Caston cleared his throat. The current offering costs out at a 20% premium over our existing telephony arrangement. Even with embedded security features, it seems to me that we're not getting the best possible value for the annualized expenditures. That's a preposterous deal, the squat Slovak said. You should have been talking to us. Caston turned to Ambler with an elaborate "I told you so" shrug. Ambler's manner was that of a bureaucrat who was fearful of future reprisals, but determined to avert a crisis while it was still possible. "We've got an office filled with people whose job that is," he said steadily. "Guess they never bothered to learn their way around Bratislava. Thing is, we were told Slovakia Telecom had the market to themselves." 2 years ago, maybe, Caston said as Verbel started to splutter with disbelief. "You are about to sign a $200 million contract, Andy, and your guys are relying on 2-year-old market analyses? Glad I'm not the one whose job it is to explain that to Congress." Bit by bit, Ambler noticed Verbel began standing a little straighter. The human top was squaring his shoulders. His annoyance at being dragged from the Two Economies One Alliance session gave way to a certain pleasure at witnessing the mutual recriminations between two powerful American officials and the prospect of a highly lucrative American contract. The Slovak's face relaxed into a genial smile. "Gentlemen, the hour is late, but it is not too late, I trust. I think we can do business together." The two Americans brought him to a small second-floor conference room at the Belvedere, one they had ascertained would be unoccupied until an ASEAN working group arrived an hour from then. Ambler knew that the conference room would be theirs, if only briefly, so long as they simply looked as if they belonged. Hotel staffers, puzzled by their appearance, would assume the mistake was their own, and given the density of VIPs in residence, their main priority would be to avoid causing offense. Laurel, dressed severely in a gray skirt and white blouse, met the two inside the small conference room and approached Joseph Verbel with the black wand-like device. Ambler made apologetic noises, just a formality. "Technically, when we're having an off-site discussion of what's officially classified information, we've got to do a scan for listening devices." Laurel waved the device, a thing fashioned out of 2 television remote controls, along the man's extremities and his torso. When she approached the badge, she paused and said, "If you'll let me remove your name tag, sir, I'm afraid the chip inside creates interference." Verbel did so with a complacent nod, and she stepped behind him, pretending to scan his back. "All right," she said presently. She replaced nylon rope around his neck, tucking the card inside his lapel. Since nobody ever looked at his own badge while it was on, Verbel would have no occasion to notice that his conference badge had been replaced by a AAA membership card. "Please sit," Ambler said, gesturing. "Can we get you some coffee?" "Tea, please," the Slovak said. "Tea it is." Then Ambler turned to Caston and said, "You've got the terms of offering?" "You mean here? We can download the encrypted files, but we'd have to use one of our machines." Caston spoke his lines a little stiffly, but it passed as the awkwardness of embarrassment. "The station boys have the Clear Connect." "Jesus Christ," Ambler said. "At the Schatzalp? You can't expect Mr. Verbel here to ride the funicular up the mountain to the Schatzalp. That's just too far. He's a busy man. We're all busy. Forget about it. Just forget about it." "But it's a bad deal," Caston said. "You can't just..." "Then I'll face the music." He turned to the Slovak. "Sorry to waste your time." Verbel broke in with a tone of lordly magnanimity. "Gentlemen, please," he said. "Your country deserves the highest consideration, not to be shaken down by a bunch of scheming zecks. My own shareholders have interests aligned with yours. Put me in the funicular. In truth, I was rather hoping for a chance to visit the Schatzalp. I'm told it's not to be missed." "Are you sure you want to take the time?" "Absolutely," said the Slovak with a $200 million smile. "Absolutely." At the main entrance to the Congress Center, the fast-moving queue sluiced between 2 movable steel fences and a no less formidable human cordon of military policemen, their cheeks pink from the cold, their breath forming sfumado puffs of smoke in the chilled air. Immediately past the entrance at the left was a series of efficiently manned coat-check stations. Then came the security area, staffed by half a dozen guards. Ambler took his time removing his coat, patting himself down as if fearful of forgetting something in his coat. He wanted to time his entrance to be certain there were plenty of people ahead of him and behind him. He now wore a blazer without a tie. The ID badge hung from his neck near the shirt's third button. Finally, he saw a crowd of men and women pushing through the entrance, and he nimbly stepped into line at the security desk. "Cold outside," he said to the man seated by the computer monitor, with what he told himself was a passable tinge of a Middle European accent, "but I guess you're used to it." He pressed his card to the frozen reader and patted his cheeks as if they were frozen. The man at the monitor glanced at the screen and at him. A light at the turnstile pulsed green, and Ambler pushed his way through a gate bar. He was in. He felt something flutter inside him, something tiny and bird-like, and he realized that it was hope. Hope, perhaps the most dangerous of all emotions, and perhaps the most necessary.